Across the UK, on DAB, online and on your smart speaker. John Pienaar at Drive on Times Radio.
Good afternoon to you. Welcome to Drive on Times Radio. I'm John Pienaar. Thanks for your company. The victims of the infected blood scandal haven't just had to wait years for the compensation announced today. They've waited decades. For them, justice has been delayed, dangled, and now finally delivered, or at least it soon will be, in the form of £100,000 cheques for some 4,000 people struck by infections like HIV and hepatitis after receiving medication that was drawn from contaminated blood plasma. There can be no justice now for the thousands who've died or for their families. It's been called the worst treatment disaster in the history of the NHS. And today on Drive, we'll look at what this scandal meant for victims. I'll be talking in a moment to a man who contracted HIV from contaminated blood and whose brother suffered the same and died of AIDS. It may be a tough listen. First, though, let's just look then at that story that some thousands of people are going to be given £100,000 compensation cheques after the scandal over contaminated blood. And about 2,400 people died after they were treated by the NHS with blood products that were infected with HIV, hepatitis C. Most of the infections, they were between 1970s and 1980s. Des Collins is a senior partner at Collins Solicitors. That's the company advising over 1,500 victims of this scandal. And he spoke to Times Radio earlier today.
At long last, these particular victims, or this section of victims, can begin to move forward, that they have achieved some sort of recognition and that the end is in sight. What it doesn't mean is that all the victims will get a compensation or that all the victims will get interim payments. And we had pushed for that at the public inquiry, and we'll continue to push it at the public inquiry, and had pushed the government for it. But at the moment, it's a very limited class of victims who will receive interim payments. It's the living infected and the widows of those who have died.
The solicitor Des Collins speaking earlier here on Times Radio. I want to welcome now to the show Suresh Vaghela, who's from Leicester and who contracted HIV from contaminated medication. For him, that treatment between 1979 and 1983 was the start of a nightmare. Suresh, good to have you with us. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
Can we start, Suresh, with you just telling us a bit about your own experience? You received, didn't you, a blood clotted protein under treatment from haemophilia, and then, well, you tell us what happened after that.
Well, it was one of these things that the hospital said that we were on this particular treatment called cryoprecipitate, which was fine, and it was helpful. It did what it was supposed to, but then this magic drug came on the scene, and it was very convenient to administer because it took less time and it was less laborious. But little did we know that it was a little ticking time bomb. That as the first treatment that I ever took was in 1977 or something like that, and since then my liver kept giving abnormal readings, and the doctors couldn't explain what was happening. And it was only as the years went by, and I was at university, and the doctors had taken some blood and said, "Oh, which was in 1983." And we've tested you for HIV. And they told me that over the phone. And I was at university, first year student, undergraduate, just making friends. And then the doctor said, well, don't tell anybody, keep it a secret. I said, well, is there anything I can do? And they said, well, all you can do is just go home and make preparations because you only have about 3 to 6 months to live. And that was it. And that was my first year of university.
All of that, Suresh, you were told this over the phone. I can't, I think, quite imagine what it must have been like for you to hear that sort of news in a telephone call. You had been infected with HIV, and they were giving you 6 months to live. I mean, you must recall how that felt at the time.
Well, it was an absolute numbing experience because, first of all, I was just prepared for them to say, well, you've got something, and we'll try this treatment, that treatment. And I wasn't expecting the devastating kind of remarks that I heard over the phone. But then after that, everything was a kind of a blur because my brother at the same time, I was at the university in Birmingham, and my brother was in Preston, and he received the same news. And both of us were tackling it in different ways. And my brother, sadly, he thought, well, if I only got 3 to 6 months, I'll be with my family a bit later on, but I'll go and say goodbye to my friends and my family in London. And he ran away from home. And I was at university thinking, well, I can't go home because I can't put this on my parents' shoulders, because I've had haemophilia all my life, and they've had to curtail some of their activities, sacrifice a lot of their dreams, just to look after my brother and I. So I thought, I can't put this on the shoulders, and but I didn't know what to do.
And you sadly lost your brother to AIDS. And what on earth must it have been like, Suresh, for your family to get this news, you and your brother at the same time? Trauma doesn't adequately cover it, does it?
No, I mean, to be honest, my brother and I, although we'd heard of HIV and AIDS and all that, we weren't fully aware of the fuller consequences, or knowing that the only thing that we knew it was a complete sort of a death sentence. But my parents, they didn't understand it, and I wouldn't say they were ignorant of the fact, but I'm glad they didn't fully understand, because I don't think they would have been able to cope. Because they were barely keeping things together as it was, and this would have just it was the final straw that would have broken the camel's back. Yeah,
I can imagine that. And I mean, you have survived that diagnosis, unlike sadly your brother, but it has had a truly remarkable effect on your life, Suresh. Just tell us a little.
I mean, since the diagnosis, because when we were diagnosed with HIV, the government decided not to tell us about the Hep C, because they thought that by the time the patients found out about the Hep C, they would have died along with the HIV. So let's not burden them with this extra news. But lo and behold, we managed to survive the HIV scandal, and then hepatitis came into play, and then cirrhosis led after that. And then that wasn't enough, because my wife and I were summoned to the hospital in Manchester, and normally the consultant just has himself and maybe the secretary or some other doctor to have a little chat with. But this time the whole room was filled. There was about 15, 20 doctors in the room, 10 foot by 10, and we were told that, did you want to find out if you had VCJD in your blood product? So it was another thing that was added, and they couldn't take it away. I said, well, would it make any difference if I said, no, I didn't want to know? I said, well, then you'd have to live with it in silence. So it was just one thing after the other. And I mean, domino's effect is a mild way of putting it, but it's just one life-threatening event happening after the other. And it's just, friends, family, if they weren't there, then I don't think I'd have got to where I am.
And I know too that, well, in your own community, this a long illness, it's seen in a particular way, isn't it? As if in some way you bear a stigma for what happened to you.
Well, it's all to do with karma. And if you have an accident, or if you're born with some kind of illness, it's not seen as, what can we do to sort of help? It's a case of, well, you must have done something bad in your previous life. So it wasn't. We couldn't get any support, any community support, because it would have kind of backfired. So we were. I mean, the doctors told us to sort of keep the news to ourselves anyway, and this is another additional way to support to keep the news within the family, the close-knit family. Because if you went outside, people would have just said, well, you're just bearing the seeds of your own.
You must have been in a very lonely place. And just lastly, Suresh, and thank you for coming on. It's been so moving to hear your story. You've made this so vivid. Now we have the announcement of this compensation, which is going to be made available. What were your thoughts when you heard that?
Well, first of all, when they first mentioned that this money was going to be made available, we thought, well, at least there's a glimmer of admission from the government, because up until now they haven't taken on the responsibility that they made any mistakes. They just still keep preaching that they gave the best treatment of the time, but it wasn't. As people have said, as Jeremy Hunt, Andy Burnham, they've all testified that we were told to give this news handed down by permanent secretaries, and it was all to cover their own backs. So when we found out about the 100,000, we thought, brilliant. But then there's a huge section of the community who've been taken out of the equation. The ones who get it will feel guilty for having it. So even the good news is marred by the government's lack of forward thinking and lack of planning. I mean, in the whole scheme of things, billions of pounds have been wasted on track and trace and all that, and they find it a quibble to find a few million pounds. I just don't understand where the thinking's coming from.
All right, Suresh, look, thank you for sharing your story with us in the way that you have. Enormous sympathies from us from what you've been through. You have been through such a lot. That is Suresh Vaghela there, just giving his take, one part of this really, really remarkable story.